Okay, let's begin with part two of our employment talk. So, what I want to talk about is how labor affects our production. So, production is limited by basically two factors: our availability of inputs, that's factors production, and our technological know-how. Now, what we're going to be discussing later on in the course is there are more limitations to production. And one of the things that we do not talk about often enough is the is natural resources. Um, when we talk about the availability of factors of production, what happens is that's assumed that scarcity in natural resources is assumed to be in this area right here. But too often we just talk about labor being a part of this, and we should also expand our discussion to include things like drinkable water, clean air, things like that. So, when we talk about employment, one of the, aside from the participation rate, another major employment indicator is the unemployment rate. And if you want to basically make the full use of your labor force, the labor force has to be fully employed. But there's going to be always be some portion of the labor force that will not have jobs. Now, sometimes this is by choice, and other times it is not. And you can see the unemployment rate over the United States for several years. In July 2012, it was 8.3. It is now 7.7 as of February 2013. And these shaded areas are areas of recession. Now, this is where GDP started to go negative, right here. And this is where GDP started to go positive. And of course, the white area is periods of economic expansion. So shaded areas, periods of economic contraction; white areas, periods of economic expansion. Now, the reason why economists like to put this, what we call recession shading, on a graph that shows an economic indicator is because it's interesting to see how an economic indicator behaves before, during, and after a recession. And so you can see here the unemployment rate fell in the go-go 90s to a low of 3.9%. And then, as typical with any recession, the unemployment rate starts to shoot up because we're producing less and we need fewer people to produce. And it peaked at about 6.5% after the recession ended. And then it started to trend down again. Then we hit the Great Recession of 2008, and you look at the dramatic increase. It peaked at 10.1%. So when comparing these two recessions, this recession right here obviously is longer. It lasted 18 months compared to 8 months here. But this recession was far more severe in terms of economic contraction, and that could be judged by how high the unemployment rate goes. Another interesting thing about this graph is you can see how we can consider this economic indicator, unemployment rate, a leading indicator going into a recession. What do I mean by leading? Well, notice how the unemployment rate hits kind of a bottom before the recession starts. So it gave us kind of a lead indicator of what was to come. And then the unemployment rate continues to climb even after the recession has ended. So this is a lagging indicator leaving a recession. In other words, it changes direction after the economy changes direction. And the same thing happens in the 2008 recession. The unemployment hits a bottom before the recession starts, a leading indicator, and then it continues to rise after the recession has ended, a lagging indicator. And so here we see the unemployment rates over the years. So the 50s, 60s, 80s, and 1000s. And again, the shaded areas are periods of recession. And so it shows how high unemployment has gone um, and over the different recessions. And we could put actually a dollar figure on unemployment. There's something called Oaken's Law. And Oaken's Law asserts that for every 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate, it's estimated to reduce output by 2%. And since we measure GDP in dollar terms, that 2% less output can be equated as money. So you could actually give me an idea. So if the unemployment rate increases from 5% to 7%, that's a 2% increase. Well, that means that will lead to 4% less output. And you simply multiply zero point 0.4 by GDP, and that will put a dollar figure on unemployment. Now, the agency that's in charge of measuring the unemployment rate is the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics conducts, well, uses two surveys. One survey they conduct, another survey the Census Bureau conducts on the behalf of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And that surveys about 60,000 households and asks them, "Hey, do you have work? Are you looking for work?" And this is where the unemployment rate is derived. So, and the unemployment rate is simply the portion of the labor force that cannot find work. So here is a active learning um, exercise that we would have done in class, but we're not going to do it now. It would be very interested. It would be helpful if you did this on your own. And one of the things to be careful about is the unemployment rate is a national figure, and it does not break it down in terms of regions, and it doesn't break it down in terms of education or sex or race. And so you could see the unemployment rate in 2003, the national average was 5.8% right here. But you could see white unemployment rate was lower, black unemployment rate was higher, Hispanic also higher than the average. And then we break it, that's males. Then we could break it down by females, and you could see how things looked. And then you could break it down by teenagers of much different level than the national average. Same thing goes for education. And then, again, in 2003, in this case, the national average is 6%. But look at high school dropouts. They had a much higher unemployment rate. And then as you increase the level of education, the unemployment rate falls. A very interesting statistic that is included in the employment data that is not widely reported in the media is the duration of unemployment. This is the typical time measured in weeks it takes someone to find a job once they start looking. And when an economy goes in a recession, it's typical that that time needed to find a job increases. And you could see that during the go-go 90s, we see that the unemployment rate was, the average time it took somebody to find a job on average was about 12 weeks. And then take a look at after the 2008 recession, the average time it took somebody to find a job was over 40 weeks. We're closing in on a year. And this, keep in mind, this is average time. So there were quite a few people who were looking for work that took them more than a year to find work. Okay, so this is where we're going to leave off. Look forward to part 3 that takes off from this point.